Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek Bihani and I am a CSPC volunteer. We acknowledge that the Canadian Science Policy Conference is taking place on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We respect our traditional hosts and thank them for allowing us to operate on this land. We are about to participate in an interactive panel titled Co-Creating Climate Action on the Front Lines, Case Studies in Community-Centered Climate Innovation, organized by the Simon Fraser University. Please don't forget to tweet about your favorite events and panels at the conference using @SciencePolicy and hashtag CSPC 2022. Finally, please don't forget to fill out the evaluation survey for the session in the program app. I hope you enjoy this panel. Thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Great, super. Thank you for braving the snow, for coming in this morning. Many of us on the panel, a large contingent, are from the West Coast. So for us, it's extremely early in the morning. And we will appreciate your engagement and your energy as we get into this very important topic this morning. I'm Alicia Main. I'm the W.J. Van Dusen Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. I'm also Associate Vice President of Knowledge Mobilization and Innovation at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Burnaby, and Surrey, Canada. And it's a delight this morning to be talking to you about co-creating climate action on the front lines and to explore some case studies in community-centered climate innovation. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, our distinguished panelists, in a moment. But first, I want to take you through some context. So I'm very excited to talk this morning about how we can work together to deliver urgently needed transformative climate solutions with community at the core. Communities in Canada and around the world are experiencing profound changes and challenges brought on by climate change. We all know this. In British Columbia, where we live, where not everyone in the panel lives, but I live, we had unprecedented drought and heat into October. And whereas that may sound nice for Vancouver to have a really warm October, there is actually profound implications for our ecosystem and our livelihoods. And if we could advance the slides, or maybe I have the power to do that. That power was not well exerted. Could I have some help in and how I advance? That's me. There, this is the slide I'm looking for. So this is some of the effects that we had this fall in British Columbia. Thousands of salmon died as the streams dried up. The rainforest was stressed by lack of precipitation. Individuals and businesses faced water scarcity and restrictions in some communities. Meanwhile, rampant wildfires burned in BC and Washington, creating elevated pollution levels and air quality advisories. Now it has rained, and in fact there's been frost also in BC, but there's fear of massive flooding like we experienced last November. And BC is, of course, not the only part of Canada facing severe weather challenges. We urgently need strategies and technologies to adapt to and mitigate climate change. But the adaptation and mitigation techniques we need are going to vary significantly by community and by region. To be successful, climate-related interventions and innovations must reflect and respond to community-specific needs. We need to co-create solutions with the communities impacted and with the buy-in and the expertise of local change agents and in the places where the solutions are needed right now. There we go. At Simon Fraser University, our institution, our researchers, our students and staff are stepping up to deliver transformative solutions. We're also working with local and global partners, including governments, industry and nonprofit organizations, First Nations, and other academic partners. And we are looking for collaborators, so we hope to have some conversations over the course of this conference. We want to help Canada further establish itself as a global leader in climate action and achieve our net zero emission goals. This transition is not going to be easy. One of the most important things that we can do as policymakers in Canada is to enable multiple pathways to get to net zero. We need to mobilize all our options, including new technology development. According to the International Energy Agency, 50% of the technologies that we need to reach net zero by 2050 are not yet developed. They're still in university research labs, and we need to mobilize them. At SFU, one too far. Scaling up green technologies through innovation and partnerships is a key strength and a key priority. We need to take the early actions that enable us to benefit not just environmentally, but also economically from new zero-carbon technologies, because the economic transition is going to be challenging. So we're working with our partners and looking for new collaborators to co-develop and implement transformative policy solutions and clean tech innovation that meet the region-specific needs of communities while enabling economic opportunities. To do so, we've established the Community-Centered Climate Innovation Program, C3I, bringing communities and world-class research together. It encompasses everything across 8 faculties that SFU researchers are working on, such as community-engaged research with key stakeholders, public policy around economic incentives and strategies to reduce carbon emissions, helping communities adapt through nature-based solutions, addressing health risks from climate change and the social inequities that they bring, and developing clean technologies, beginning at the very fundamental level with chemistry and physics, right up through engineering and the creation of spin-out companies that make an impact. We have 3 integrative research streams to get there. You can see on the slide behind me, adaptation, mitigation, and sustainability, which address this highly interdisciplinary and collaborative research effort to achieve low carbon resilient communities. And all of our research is informed by the foundational approaches of community partnerships, innovation, and Indigenous knowledge. So one of the streams, the first stream, adaptation, is going to protect people, places, and infrastructure from community-specific hazards of climate change. And so research in this stream include place-based community science hazard identification, open access knowledge sharing and exchange, and the design and adoption of resilient community, social and green infrastructure, and nature-based solutions. The mitigation stream, the second stream, there we go. Our mitigation stream here is focused on decarbonizing energy sources and economies. It's based on identifying and co-developing net zero solutions that are suitable for each community and mobilizing low-carbon solutions through interdisciplinary education, demonstration, and pilot projects with community stakeholders. And finally, this is all brought together in a stream, an integrative stream on sustainability, which seeks to accelerate resilient community transitions. That integrates the research, the earlier research in adaptation and mitigation, while delivering sustainability transitions in communities and an inclusive development path forward to optimize low-carbon resilience opportunities. So today's panel is inspired by the C3I goals of co-creating solutions with the communities impacted and those who can enact that change. We have researchers from Simon Fraser University, from the Action on Climate team, from the Sustainable Energy Engineering Program, and our community partners from the City of Burnaby, along with National Research Centre, with a researcher that has expertise in community collaboration and nature-based solutions. They're going to explore with us this morning some case studies in community-centered climate innovation, and then we'll make sure to have a chance to have audience participation to join the discussion and ask questions. So first off, immediately to my left, we have Dr. Alison Shaw, and she's the Executive Director of ACT, the Action on Climate team. Alison and her team help communities and organizations embed low-carbon resilience and nature-based solutions into their planning and decision-making. And actually, I had a nice picture of you, but now I put it up. There we go. Next, directly beside Alison, we have Enda Murphy, who's a research engineer with the National Research Council's Ocean, Coastal, and River Engineering Research Center. Enda has more than 16 years of coastal engineering research design and consultancy experience, and is presently steering a multidisciplinary research partnership focused on understanding the performance of coastal nature-based solutions. And Alison and Enda are going to focus on the adaptation stream of research of community-centered climate innovation in the questions that they answer. Next to Enda, we have Dr. Sami Khan, who's a professor of sustainable energy engineering at Simon Fraser University, and he and his research team are pursuing the development of infrastructure solutions to help mitigate climate change. And one region Sami is focusing on is the Canadian North. And last but certainly not least, we have James Lotta, who is the general manager of lands and facilities for the city of Burnaby. James is a professional engineer, and he has extensive experience working with various levels of government, First Nations, land developers, and industry to raise capital, design and construct utility-scale alternative energy projects and natural gas projects. And Sami and James are going to focus on the mitigation stream. And James is a great example of the kind of collaboration at the community level that we've been working very intensely on. So let's get started. I'm going to try to detach this microphone and pass it around to you. And I'm going to start with some questions on adaptation for Alison and Enda to start with. And so, Alison, first to you. Beginning with the adaptation theme, let's talk about some of the cascading climate-exacerbated impacts of floods, fires, and heat that threaten communities. So I wonder if you could, to do so, you could explain low-carbon resilience and how it applies to climate action. Let me just see if I could detach this.
Hi, thank you, Alicia, for the question. Thank you, everyone, for joining the conversation today. My name is Alison Shaw. I'm with the Action on Climate team at SFU, which was previously known as the Adaptation to Climate Change team, which has been working on adaptation nationally for the past 15 years. And in essence, what we do is try and transform the concept of climate action. Climate action typically in national and local policy has focused on emissions reduction. And, for the past 15 years, the ACT team has been really advocating for more proactive adaptation strategies toward the projected impacts of climate change, which, as Alicia had mentioned, are, the devastating impacts that we're all getting familiar with: drought, wildfire, heat, and extreme weather. And so really the low carbon resilience approach that we've been fostering, mobilizing, and evaluating at ACT is largely about putting adaptation into climate action. So instead of just focusing on reducing emissions to minimize the impacts of climate change, we also need to focus on regional and local adaptations to these projected hazards. And so the low carbon resilience approach is about essentially understanding your risks and vulnerabilities within your regions and localities in order to better make decisions around long-term projects and investments, for instance. If we look at adaptation and mitigation in isolation, we run the risk of building really highly efficient LEED certified buildings in high risk zones such as floodplains, and reducing the project lifespan as well as the return on investment over time. If we think about doing adaptation in isolation from thinking about emissions reduction, we run the risk of turning on air conditioning during heat waves, which essentially exacerbates the problems. So the low carbon resilience approach is about looking at how to adapt to projected climate impacts in a low carbon manner. But the other element of a low carbon resilience approach is that climate action doesn't happen in a vacuum. It actually is tethered to all kinds of social, economic, and environmental objectives. And to start linking the reduction of climate risk, the reduction of emissions, to other sustainable development goals is of critical importance. So, for instance, we often hear about increasing public transportation, which decreases congestion on the roads, gets people out of their cars, reducing emissions, improves air quality, improves the possibility for biodiversity planning, et cetera, et cetera. So we're interested with the low carbon resilience approach in multi-solving solutions that actually become part of our way and a community's way to transition to sustainability.
Great. Thank you, Alison. I'm going to give you one follow-up before moving on to Enda. And I wonder if you could take us through an example of a nature-based solution that helps develop resilience to different types of these climate hazards that we've been facing.
Yeah, sure. So one of the strategies that has emerged in our work at ACT, I failed to mention we've been working with about 10 municipalities across the province of BC on opportunities to embed low carbon resilience approach in corporate planning, community planning, asset management, business prioritization, and different elements of decision processes at the community scale. And so one of the key opportunities that has emerged as a low carbon resilience strategy in a lot of these communities is the concept of nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are essentially protecting the ecosystem, the ecological processes and services that are being provided by nature for free to our communities, and encompasses the protection, restoration, and expansion of natural assets such as forests, trees, wetlands, soils, as well as the promotion of green infrastructure solutions that help ecological processes maintain themselves, such as rain gardens, engineered stormwater ponds, these kinds of things. And so communities are really starting to investigate nature-based solutions as a way to reduce risks, flood risk, for instance, because a lot of these nature-based solutions absorb and retain excess precipitation, which is projected for many communities, as well as provides shading and temperature moderation in heat events. And so these are adaptation-oriented strategies, but also nature-based solutions, of course, store and sequester carbon. They avoid expanded emissions-intensive and costly infrastructure, such as expanded stormwater drainage solutions. And they contribute to other community goals, such as biodiversity, in certain cases, equity, lots of cases around that, as well as human health and well-being, for instance.
Great. Thank you for that comprehensive answer, Alison. And building on what Alison's just talked with us about nature-based solutions, you also have done extensive research into nature-based solutions, but in your case for coastal flood and erosion management. And we're seeing, the devastating flooding and erosion due to more powerful hurricanes, for example. What are some of your recommendations as communities rebuild and prepare for extreme weather?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. And I think, I'm always sensitive about, in the wake of some of the devastating events we've had recently, particularly Hurricane Fiona, about, making strong recommendations to communities who are still recovering from these sort of disastrous events. But I think, what I would like to see us do is think a bit more strategically and think about the next event and the event after that and how we're going to manage those risks. So I guess, if I was speaking to communities, the questions I would ask them to think about are, first, do we have a good understanding of risk, and not just a basic level, but in all the dimensions of risk. So one of the ways we've been trying to help communities understand that over the past several years is through an applied research program with Natural Resources Canada, focused on communities in coastal regions, on better understanding the risk in those communities. So developing regional data sets, allowing them to use those data sets to provide new insight to the risks that they face, which can provide a strong baseline of understanding by which you can then begin to compare different strategies for managing that risk and adapting going forward. So that's the first question, understanding the risk. The second, question I would ask communities to consider is, have you got a strong strategy in place to manage risk over time? So you know, and really in the coastal realm, what this means is some element of strategic shoreline management planning. This is something that can bring together multiple tiers of government to work on a common approach to planning on the coast. That provides a framework, a broad brush framework, essentially for communities, but also provinces and the federal government to deploy solutions in different ways and prioritize them in the places where they're most needed. And the nice thing about that sort of strategic approach is that it allows balance. So it allows communities to consider, you know, what areas need to be protected in perpetuity, what areas do we need to gradually think about perhaps retreating from over time, or implementing more nature-based solutions like Alison mentioned. And then the third question I would suggest that communities should be asking themselves is, the next event that occurs, the next disaster that occurs, do we have a strong post-disaster response plan in place? One that will allow us to implement improvements in our resilience, but also that allows us to build back better following that event. So it's really not useful to be thinking about those things in the midst of an event. You need to have a solid plan in place. And so on, you know, part of that I think involves more deployment of nature-based solutions. And so in coastal communities, we've been working with a number of communities across Canada to trial pilot demonstrations of different types of nature-based solutions to better understand their performance. In the coastal realm, nature-based solutions are not really new. Over the past 5 years, I've been working with an international working group led by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to develop international guidelines for implementation of nature-based solutions in coastal environments, but also riverine environments. And so there's a lot of information out there internationally that we can learn from and adopt, but our uptake in Canada has been relatively slow. And so we've been working in the past several years to try and understand why that is, and have conducted extensive interviews with experts and practitioners across the country. And one of the pieces of feedback we've been getting, particularly from communities, is that there's a lack of strong understanding of how certain types of nature-based solutions perform in some of the unique coastal environments we have in Canada. And so that's how we're hopeful that some of these pilots will shed some light on that and contribute to the development of guidance that is not only suitable at a national level, but tailored to specific community needs, concerns, and situations.
Thank you, and could you just briefly give us an example of one of those pilots?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the communities we've been working with for the past several years is Semiahmoo First Nation. So this is a small First Nation in the lower mainland of BC, situated essentially on the U.S.-Canada border and on the coast of Boundary Bay. And they've really been showing leadership in partnering with municipalities, the City of Surrey, City of Delta in the region, to explore the application of what they call a living dike to provide coastal flood protection to the communities, but also to begin to sort of address some of the historical damage to the environment that has occurred in that area, with a view to scaling up in the future. And so Semiahmoo is a community, I guess, that has been in some ways cut off from their traditional territories as a resource for hunting and fishing by past colonial practices, and also development in the region. And so for them, understanding the performance of nature-based solutions is one example of how they can begin to sort of address some of those past challenges and move forward and develop and improve an understanding of how we can support sustainable development on the coast.
Thanks very much. And Alison, over to you. Could you speak to us a little bit about the policy instruments that we have and any kind of new modes of governance or policy collaboration that are needed to enable low-carbon resilient solutions?
Yes, thank you for that. Well, the policy instruments that I've been working with have been at the local government scale. And so some of the instruments that local governments that we've been working with have been using are essentially developing corporate low carbon resilience policies, so that essentially every decision that is invested in, every project that is certified to go ahead, has some requirement around understanding climate risk of that particular project and the risk, the minimization of that risk for the community, as well as a clear understanding of how a project is going to actively and proactively reduce emissions, and the way that that project will also contribute to social, economic, and environmental objectives. And so corporate policy has been probably our strongest lever that we've identified in local governments. Again, there are some points of leverage that are being developed in asset management currently at the local government scale. So asset management is typically just involved facilities and infrastructure, and of course, communities across Canada are all experiencing aging infrastructure that was built decades ago. And so there's this emerging interest in really understanding how nature-based solutions and our riverine systems and our urban forests can actually support stormwater management to take some of the burden off that aging infrastructure. So there's new policy tools that are being developed as we speak to actually include nature and natural assets in municipal accounting, so that municipalities have a full suite of a full inventory of the natural assets that are actually providing services to communities. So that's a very exciting development and is currently being considered at the federal scale as well. One of the critical things that we've noticed in working with communities is that climate action has been something that's been kind of pushed aside off someone's desk in municipalities rather than being a central feature. And so that's something that ACT has been working with communities on, is to say, you cannot be doing social equity, you cannot be doing business planning, and you can't be doing development permitting without having a strong understanding of the types of increasing exposure for new infrastructure that's being developed, increasing exposure and vulnerability to climate risks, as well as the need to help communities achieve their low carbon, zero emissions goals. So one of the things that has been a huge barrier in this work has been the funding for climate action. So climate action is funded for local governments either as emissions reduction, mitigation planning, or adaptation, less so adaptation, and doing risk and vulnerability assessments. And this funding is siloed, and it's also kind of set apart from corporate decision making. And so this is an area that really could expedite and accelerate low carbon resilience planning if we were able to get federal and provincial funding for local governments to do this type of work where they actually better understand their climate risks and take the actions necessary to build emissions reduction strategies that enhance a sustainability transition. So there you have it.
Thank you very much, Alison. So, and over to you. Alison spoke about some of the barriers to implementing solutions at a community level and some of the siloing of programs. Do you want to speak to any other barriers or opportunities or policy instruments that could enable low carbon resilient solutions?
Sure, yeah, and I think, one of the barriers we've found through a review that we conducted for the Canadian Standards Association is simply an understanding of the performance of different types of nature-based solutions in the coastal realm. And so that's something we're working to understand, but in some cases it's not really about performance. It's about perceptions. And so the goal of our research in this space is not just to develop the evidence base that can support the deployment of coastal nature-based solutions around Canada, but also to essentially mainstream it as a concept, because there are some municipalities who perceive nature-based solutions as perhaps less effective, less resilient to extreme conditions. But even in the wake of Hurricane Fiona, we've seen examples on the East Coast of examples where nature-based solutions have in some cases outperformed conventional infrastructure in delivering coastal resilience benefits. I saw photographs from a colleague from a location on PEI where the simple difference in how a neighbor was managing their lawn compared to the neighbor next door had a massive impact on the extent to which erosion impacted those properties following Hurricane Fiona. And so the neighbor who had not mowed his lawn essentially was more resilient to the impacts of that storm simply because of the root systems that had developed there and stabilized the soil. So that is to many people still counterintuitive and sort of pie in the sky idea, but the evidence actually is there to support this. So I think that's something we would like to first of all uncover, to show where should we deploy nature-based solutions, because I think it's not either nature-based solutions or conventional solutions. I think we need both, and we need to deploy them strategically and in tandem and across multiple levels of government, following sort of whole systems approaches. And so I think that's where the research that we're doing with communities will help to uncover some of the examples where things work, where things maybe don't work so well, and then communicate that information to a broader audience through things like design guides, standards that will allow for more effective deployment going forward.
Thank you. And one last point from Alison on the adaptation stream before we move to mitigation. And thank you very much, and for giving me a great reason for being late in mowing my lawn all next summer. So I have the right language now.
It's a nature-based solution. Although lawn is not all that nature-based, but that's a different conversation. I just wanted to also reinforce that a lot of the work that around climate action in municipal governments is not rocket science work. It's really about building cross-departmental teams to understand climate risk and to understand how to achieve emissions reduction targets. I just wanted to reinforce that, because a lot of the real incredible work that we've done with local governments has really been a product of cross-departmental collaboration. So that doesn't sound like a big deal, but one of the examples I could give you is one of our rock star communities that we've been working with for the past 4 or 5 years, Port Moody, built a cross-departmental team to learn about their climate risks, prioritize them, look for low-carbon resilient strategies, and is now advancing a comprehensive and systemic nature-based solutions strategy for their community that focuses on ecological processes from natural assets and green infrastructure. So it's linking nature and surrounding nature with municipal bylaws. And the team that is moving that forward comes from finance, comes from engineering, comes from planning, comes from environmental biology and rec, green spaces. So you're getting people together to really think systemically about how to approach new strategies, and that's a new governance innovation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alison. Now I'm going to bring James and Sammy into the conversation, and we're going to switch gears, although we're not siloed in our approach, but we're going to switch gears to focus a little bit on mitigation, and particularly on decarbonizing energy sources and economies. And I want to start with you, James. I wonder if you could describe for us some of the approaches the city of Burnaby is developing and some projects that you're working on towards decarbonization. And I'm going to pass the mic all the way down.
Thanks, Alicia. And absolutely, we're not siloed in Werner's approach either. So we are basically trying to use every tool in our toolbox to try and solve climate action. So adaptation, certainly, we're looking at that, and we basically divide it into two main buckets. It's transportation and buildings. And so for transportation, we're trying to promote multimodal transportation, so use of transit and making bike lanes and walking facilities, and trying to develop that infrastructure to make sure that, basically we're trying to reduce the amount of vehicle kilometers traveled is what we're trying to do there. We're also looking at fuels, so trying to produce infrastructure for electric vehicles and renewable natural gas and hydrogen is what we're trying to do to make sure that all these alternative fuels can be used conveniently and accessibly by everyone. On the building side, definitely adaptation is one of our focuses. So we're trying to look at smarter land use planning. So trying to make smartly denser communities where you can live, work, and play in a more compact area. There's building step code trying to make buildings more energy efficient. And the other thing we're doing is also fuels in buildings. So we're trying to use so that people are less reliant on fossil fuels to heat and cool their buildings. We're looking at, again, hydrogen as a source, renewable natural gas. We're also looking at creating our own projects where we're trying to use our resources in the community and keep them in the community. So I guess this concept of circular economy, where for example, we're building our own organic recycling facility where when we collect lawn clippings and when people do mow their lawns, and we're trying to capture that to produce renewable natural gas and produce compost that people can use in their gardens and community gardens and whatnot. So so we're trying to take a multifaceted approach to decarbonizing.
The loving microphone as opposed to the loving cup. Here we go. It's going back and forth. I'm going to ask you two questions at once so the microphone can stay in that area. And it's going to be first to Sammy and then to James. Sammy, can you talk to us a little bit about how existing energy infrastructure might be able to be used to be repurposed to deliver low carbon and green energy solutions? And just talk to us about some of your research along those lines, and then maybe ask James to contribute from the City of Burnaby side on that same question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alicia. So as James mentioned, hydrogen energy is being touted as the fuel of the future. Hydrogen gas is clean, so on combustion it generates water, but also it has the energy output that can be comparable to what we get from fossil fuels. So it is a good replacement for fossil fuels like natural gas. But there's a problem. Hydrogen cannot just be a copy-paste solution. So you cannot just take natural gas pipelines and put hydrogen in there, because hydrogen can go through pipes. It is the smallest atom that we know. So as it starts to be put into pipes, it can dissociate, and then it can go through the wall of the pipes and come out. And then it can also cause the pipe to become brittle. So this is a safety challenge, and this has been known for many centuries, and this are many decades, and this is called hydrogen embrittlement. So this is an area of research we're collaborating from my lab with the City of Burnaby, and we're asking ourselves the question, if we want to use existing infrastructure that Canada has, the existing pipelines, then they would have to be repurposed and made safe for hydrogen. So how could we apply some technologies that we know from the lab to these pipes directly, rather than have to replace the entire pipe to make sure that hydrogen is transported safely? And that's also where another area of research we're interested in is fluorine-free materials. So you all are familiar with non-stick coatings, which you used in pans and cookware. This is typically Teflon, which has fluorine, and fluorine-based molecules stay in the environment for a long time, and they're essentially called forever chemicals because they don't degrade. So we're studying how we can use non-fluorine alternatives and safer materials that could also be nature-derived that can also address this challenge with hydrogen embrittlement.
And what we're doing from the municipal side to make technologies like this viable are to try and, I guess, introduce regulation that maintains the flexibility into the future. So, we could only dream of what technologies might be available, 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. And so we want to make sure that buildings and infrastructure are designed to accept these new technologies like hydrogen. So we don't want to just, put in regulation that commits a building to electrify completely, because that might not be the technology of choice in 5, 10 years from now. And so some things we're trying to do is one big project we're working on is a district energy system, where we're trying to not only use electricity and natural gas, but also hydrogen, industrial waste heat. We're trying to use every tool in our toolbox to try and solve this wicked problem. And so we're trying to maintain the flexibility through our regulation and zoning bylaws and whatnot.
Thank you. I wonder if both Sammy and James, if you can also talk to us a little bit about, from your point of view, how zero emissions energy technologies could be made cost competitive with incumbent technologies to make them viable for adoption by energy ecosystems, and also, what are the steps towards doing that?
So one of the main things that we're working on is trying to be able to reuse existing infrastructure. So one of the main costs, as Allison was talking about before, is asset management and the cost of new infrastructure. So if we can find ways to reuse existing infrastructure, that goes a long way. And also we're trying to help that by, again, trying to smartly zone through zoning bylaws and land use regulation, trying to make communities more compact, so that if we do have to build more infrastructure, it's in a smaller area. But that's one of the main things we're trying to do.
And to add to that, I would say also following a stepwise process to replace hydrogen in natural gas pipelines. So blending natural gas with hydrogen is a good first step to see on one end what are the safety implications of that, but then also as it gives time for hydrogen technologies to mature and become cost effective, the blending approach can be a good intermediary.
Great, thank you. And before we move across to integrating and sustainability and involve all the panel's members, I wonder, Sammy, if you could talk briefly to any sort of, from the perspective of a university researcher, a university professor, and someone who leads a graduate lab, could you talk about the kind of entrepreneurial capabilities or innovation intermediaries that help you in trying to get solutions out, whether through a science-based venture or through other partnerships with community and industry?
So the program I teach at SFU, it's called Sustainable Energy Engineering. So it is. It started in 2019 as a initiative that wants to show to undergraduate students at the very beginning, at the very start of their education, that what are the principles of sustainability that can go into the traditional models of engineering that we know, with constructing buildings, constructing energy systems. So this multidisciplinarity starts from the very beginning, and in our projects with the students, we encourage students to think about innovations from the lab and how that can be scaled up into the ventures. At SFU, we have a program called I2I, which Alicia actually leads. So this program encourages students to think about ideas and gives them the ecosystem and the support network to take the ideas out into market. Now, to add to that, working with communities is the key message of this panel. So in terms of communities, we can look at urban communities and remote communities across Canada. So when we're looking at sustainable energy solutions for these communities, we have to look at their needs, because the needs of an urban community like Burnaby would be quite different from urban remote communities that are disconnected from the grid. So that's where we're looking at, we're studying biomass energy systems. So we're working with a company in the BC area that is providing simple biomass combustors that can be used by remote communities, and that's also where they can stop reliance on diesel by using biomass. And this could also include shavings from the lawn mowing. So any kind of biomass which we have in abundance in Canada can be used in these combustors. So that's why we ask questions: what are the challenges for these systems, for the communities to implement these systems, but to do it in a self-sustaining way where the systems can last for many years without maintenance. And this is something we saw during the COVID pandemic. So if there is a system, let's say a windmill system or a solar system that's operating in a remote community, if there is no access to maintenance on a regular schedule, then how can these systems operate by themselves? Are they also applicable in the community, and can community members also use these systems? So that's where multidisciplinarity is an important part of our research. So we develop technologies in the lab, but then we also work with professors across SFU and also community partners to scale up these solutions and take them to communities.
Great. Thank you, Sammy. Now is the part where we knit these pieces together and talk about the solutions, the low-carbon resilient solutions that communities could be stepping up to do. And so I'm going to first take Allison and then the question to James to talk to us a little bit about how communities envision a low-carbon resilience future, and then some of the real definitive actions that communities could take right now to start dealing with climate change impacts. And I'd ask you to give us an example that you think would capture the imagination here. So Allison, first to you.
Thank you. The way that communities are envisioning low carbon resilient strategies is, as I mentioned, quite siloed across most communities. And so one of the roles that ACT plays is really trying to bring that science policy interface together and move best available research to action through these cross-departmental teams that we develop with our municipal partners. And that strategy is welcome in a lot of municipalities because essentially what happens is we start with a risk and vulnerability assessment to really kind of put together data on projected climate impacts within that community from a multi-hazard perspective. So not just focusing on flood or drought or wildfire, but looking at each of these independent impacts together as projected climate risks for the community. And then really trying to determine alongside these local government staff, who are all very talented in their own right, to prioritize what risks to infrastructure, vulnerable populations, and ecosystems are high priority and need to be addressed right away. And then looking at the opportunity to address those risks in a way that does not increase emissions. And so what we're encouraging with local governments and what local governments are hungry for in this space right now is just innovations in these ways. At ACT, I talk a lot about climate change not being an environmental challenge, it's a social design challenge. And so if we can start kind of overcoming the silos of our local institutions and provincial and federal institutions as well, and really start using the competencies and the capacity that exists within these institutions, there's a real opportunity to elevate innovative thinking. And so one of the examples of this is this natural asset strategy in Port Moody, emerging from cross-departmental, interdisciplinary kind of thinking. And we're in the midst of that case study right now on nature-based solutions and moving that forward. Another example of a community that we've begun working with that is quite innovative and showcases the opportunity to do things differently is ACT's new partnership with the Okanagan Nation Alliance, so a First Nations organization, to look at a bioregional scale across a territorial scale at climate risks projected for the Okanagan Valley, which of course are pretty dramatic because the Okanagan Valley is Canada's only desert. And so it's expected to get hotter and drier. And so even though Kelowna is a central point and is one of the fastest growing cities in Canada, we're thinking about water scarcity into the future. So working with the Okanagan Nation, what we're hoping to achieve is to better understand their Indigenous knowledge about the natural ecosystem, the hydrological processes, the natural assets that manage that ecosystem, and really get into a new kind of two-eyed seeing way of managing climate impacts at a regional scale or a bioregional scale. And so what this particular case hopes to show is that there's opportunities to create new governance innovation moving forward that actually can capitalize on diverse knowledges and promote resilience for communities and regions into the future.
Thank you very much, Alison. And James, over to you again, the same question about how the city of Burnaby is envisioning its low carbon resilient strategy, and anything that, actions that are immediate that either the city of Burnaby or other communities you'd advise that they could do right now to start the path towards this strategy.
I totally echo everything that Alison said, that this really, local governments do hunger for this innovation, for this cross-functional knowledge and application of that knowledge to solve this problem. So Burnaby's vision is really to have industry and residential live in harmony, frankly, with nature, and for us to be able to do that and use all of our resources to their fullest extent. And so one of the things, like I mentioned before, a couple of the things we're working on now are, for example, a district energy system where we can use our industrial waste heat and our energy sharing and our access to existing infrastructure and geothermal to satisfy the needs of all our residents and businesses. And it sounds a bit like a catchphrase, and so I'm hesitant to use it. But there are examples of this triple bottom line concept where you can provide clean energy at a low cost and have a secure energy source if we can unlock this cross-functional knowledge sharing between the groups. We're also working on some advice or that I'd implore other local governments to use is to have that knowledge sharing not only internally amongst the city of Burnaby staff, but we're also reaching out to other municipalities not only in Canada but all over the world. So, for example, we're working with local governments in the Netherlands right now for this concept of living dikes. So how can we design buildings and land use to retreat from riparian areas and have more of a living dike rather than building a 20-foot concrete wall, for example. So things like that. Even our organic recycling a project where we want to use the food scraps and lawn clippings and, when leaves fall in the fall, use that resource as an energy source that we can do that. And again, that's another example of where we truly believe that's another, again, triple bottom line type example where we can use the resources at our disposal to satisfy our needs. The other thing we're working on is we're also working on a concept of smart cities, where we want to take measurements, take baselines. So we want to use sensors and big data programs to find out what the problems are. Because what we're finding is that in a lot of cases, don't even know what the problems are. And so until you access the data and you let the data speak to you, then it can tell you, where we should focus, and then if we're not focusing in a certain area, where we probably should be focusing. So we're trying to use that concept of smart cities to gather as much information as we can, again, to create that baseline and tell us where the future problems might lie, where we might have a blind spot.
And just to follow on from James's comment, not knowing where the problems lie in our work with local governments, many of them really don't understand their vulnerable populations, for instance. So we know that climate impacts at the local scale are going to disproportionately impact already marginalized and vulnerable populations, ranging from seniors to low-income families to other marginalized areas. And so one of the great examples of a low-carbon resilience approach actually comes from the city of Windsor here in Ontario, as they embarked to reduce their emissions and to promote their zero-carbon city by 2050. They started looking at key opportunities to start reducing emissions in their housing. And the housing, of course, out east is different than what we're used to in the west. It's draftier. It's built earlier in the century, those types of things. And so the city of Windsor prioritized low-income neighborhoods and housing for retrofits to ensure that those buildings were meeting energy efficiency standards. And at the same time as doing that, they were creating adaptive strategies for very vulnerable populations that would otherwise be disproportionately impacted by heat waves, by extreme weather, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an example of an equitable low-carbon resilience approach. And I just wanted to reinforce that climate action needs to include equity as well moving forward so that we're building equitable approaches to our sustainability solutions.
Thank you very much, Ellison, for that excellent point. And at this point, I'd like to open it up to our audience here for questions you have of the panelists, perhaps for an inspirational example that you bring from your community that you'd like us to dig a little bit deeper into. And I'm not sure if you're going to just shout out and then I'm going to repeat the question, or maybe come up and ask your question. Shannon, do you want to come to start?
Thanks very much. Shannon Bard from University of British Columbia. This is a question for James. So one of the challenges we hear from innovators who have solutions that would be applicable to local governments is that municipal governments are slow to make decisions. And the biggest challenges that they have is not with the big municipalities, Metro Vancouver, City of Burnaby, others that have buildings full of engineers. It's the small municipalities that have to rely on consulting engineers who do not want to sign off on a new innovation because they don't want to take the professional and the insurance liability. So can you talk about how you've overcome those challenges in Burnaby and what advice you would have for smaller municipalities?
Great, that's a great question. And I think what we're trying to do is basically show leadership. So the bigger municipalities that have, the resources, governments typically don't rush to be the first. They don't want to be on the cutting edge, but they rush to be second. And so I think if some of the bigger municipalities can show leadership and say, look, this is okay, and to de-risk it, frankly, for the smaller municipalities, then we find that the smaller municipalities are more, encouraged to take on the leap, to make sure that someone else has done it before and someone has made the mistakes before them. So that's.
Thank you for the question, Shannon. I just wanted to say that in our work at ACT, it's actually the rural and smaller local governments that have been the major innovators, and largely because they're not as siloed as the big cities are, and so there's a lot of cross-departmental exchange. So I just wanted to reinforce that.
Thank you. And please introduce yourself. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm John Holdren, Harvard University and formerly President Obama's science advisor. My question is, what more should regional governments and national government do to better enable community-centered responses? What is lacking from the regional and national government?
Thank you very much. Who would like to take first dibs at that question? Allison, and then pass it down.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I call it the skill testing question, because our local governments in Canada are pretty much strapped finance-wise. There's only a couple of ways that municipalities can make money to sustain the services that they're providing, and those two primary areas, tax base and service pricing, essentially incentivize unmitigated growth. And so a lot of local governments are really, really kind of incentivized to do the wrong thing right now in terms of expanding into greenfield areas, and promoting broad infrastructure that obviously has significant costs in terms of operations and management over time and so forth. There's a real devolving of responsibility from the federal and provincial governments to local governments right now, not only on climate action, but on homelessness and affordability. And so local governments are really looking for opportunities for some of this innovation funding. So funding that can actually be applied to multi-solve across some of these issues. And at ACT, we really see the low carbon resilience approach as a window of opportunity to start that multi-solving conversation. Because once you start looking at climate risk in your infrastructure, in your ecosystems, and your vulnerable populations, you start getting into areas of equity planning, social planning, land use planning, service planning in terms of water and stormwater management, et cetera. And so it's a real opportunity for federal and provincial governments to finance this window, because as Alicia has mentioned previously, every local government is context dependent. They're going to have different priorities. They're going to have different geographies that they're working within. And so to actually create financing for local governments to tackle these issues is the biggest thing, I think.
Yeah, I can maybe just add on the coastal resilience side, the sort of the fragmented governance and jurisdiction systems that we have is a major barrier, and something myself and Matt Osler from the City of Surrey highlighted in a report on coastal flood risk in BC. But I think what's needed there, particularly to address some of the capacity issues at some particularly smaller municipal levels, is a mechanism to bring together multiple levels of government to focus on managing risk, at least in the coastal space, on a system-wide scale. So there are some examples of that in Canada that I think we can learn from and maybe even improve upon. Conservation authorities in Ontario, for example, manage river flood risk on a basin-wide scale. And there are also examples of conservation authorities that have banded together on Lake Ontario to develop shoreline management plans that move beyond sort of their jurisdictional boundaries. So I think we need more of that. The BC provincial government has initiated a process of developing a provincial flood strategy, which has this sort of watershed-based process at its core. It's a really challenging process given sort of the division of responsibilities and authorities among different levels of government and the different levels of capacity at municipalities and also First Nations communities in BC. But I think those are the types of initiatives that are needed with leadership from regional, federal, provincial governments to basically to bring communities together to plan their response, as opposed to sticking within jurisdictional lanes and applying regulatory approaches, because I don't think we can regulate our way out of the challenge of climate change.
I will add that partnerships with universities are beneficial for communities. to have innovation, the pillars there, you need to have people who are coming up with innovative ideas and have a platform to propagate their ideas into fruition, but then also space. And this is something which universities provide. And through projects for undergraduate students in their 4th year or the 3rd year, where they can get together and work on a community-specific challenge, is going to be beneficial for communities. But then also follow up after that, whatever ideas were brainstormed, if that can be integrated into their plans in a meaningful way, and also give the students opportunities to continue working on this after they graduate. So I would say including that partnership with universities is crucial.
The only other thing I'd add to all that is I guess better information and education on how to access the funding. So even though funding might be available to local governments, it's typically accompanied by a lot of restrictions and red tape, and especially the smaller municipalities, like to the earlier point, they don't have the resources to navigate through the forest of red tape to get. So even if and as a government employee, I understand the need for red tape and restrictions, but so if there are those restrictions and red tape, maybe more education and information on how to navigate it, and so how to get better access to that funding.
Great, thank you. Do we have another question from the audience? Yes, please step forward. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Tony Bassett. I'm from Genome Prairie, and I want to thank the panel. And I just want to say that the things that you're talking about, the strategies, I think are courageous, and I really applaud municipalities like Burnaby for taking this action. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. And I wanted to ask just a variation on that question. The city I come from, it's more difficult. Message to try and convince decision makers, especially at a municipal level, to go down this path. A few years ago, we had bike paths installed in the downtown area, and it created such a high degree of public outrage that they ripped them up a year after they installed them. And my question is essentially this. The solutions you're talking about, who needs to be the driving force behind convincing, whether they're small municipalities or large municipalities, local governments, who needs to be the driving force behind convincing municipalities to go down this road? Because if you're a city councilor, you might not want to do it because it's not a popular venture. People say, well, I'd rather have money used on streets rather than have money used on a climate mitigation strategy. What are your opinions on what needs to drive this home?
Thank you for that. And I think possibly Alison and James would have, from your comments earlier, would want to take on that question about incentives.
Sure. That's a difficult question given the community you're coming from. With the communities that ACT has been working with, one of the most significant drivers has been a desire to proactively understand what's coming down the pipe. So, to really start looking around and seeing, for instance, in 2021 in Canada, there were so many climate-related events that insured losses were $2.1 billion, right? If we're talking about direct and indirect losses, that number is closer to $9.2 billion. And so for municipalities that have a fiduciary responsibility to, to spend taxpayers' money, it's important to understand these risks as part of your investing portfolio. And so a lot of communities are starting to see climate risk and key vulnerabilities, and in that regard, from an infrastructure perspective. And then once you start getting into, okay, what are the risks to our communities in terms of these multiple hazards that we're looking at over the next 20 years, for instance, And what are these risks to our buildings and our transportation systems and our service infrastructure? Then you can start branching out into what are the risks to our vulnerable populations, what are the risks to our natural assets and our ecosystems moving forward. It just provides a window. But I think most municipalities, especially the ones that aren't as proactive, it's really getting in about, the responsibility of local government to provide services and sustainable service delivery over time.
I can completely relate to your example because I still have bruises from all the sidewalks and bike lanes that we've tried to put in, and to answer your question, really, like, everyone has to buy in for it to be successful. And so, first of all, I want to give credit to our mayor and council because they have been courageous at standing up to, frankly, what's right. And so, and the tack we're trying to take in Burnaby is, I mentioned before, we're trying to expand our smart cities initiative to have, data. And that's what we're trying to do, is that when we've had these public engagement sessions on bike lanes and energy infrastructure, for example, and people are up in arms because they're going to lose parking in front of their house because a new sidewalk's getting put in. What really helps is information and data, because, Burnaby, for those of you who don't, is quite hilly. And so whenever we try to put a bike lane, everyone says, oh, no one will ride their bikes here. It's too steep. But the data is showing that, in fact, with the advent of electric bikes and whatnot, a lot of cyclists will show up. And so we find that, if you take that pragmatic approach, that fact-based decision-making, that people generally come around, and so that's what we're trying to do now. But it absolutely requires the courage of the elected officials to stand behind staff when they make these recommendations. So.
Great. The image I'm going to have from this panel, beyond the great ideas, is the microphone moving back and forth. But I wanted to give each of you a chance to give one final thought to the audience here this morning. It could be an example that you haven't been asked about yet, that you think has useful lessons for other communities. It could be a call to action. But some closing remark for the audience here today on community-centered climate innovation.
Well, I guess what I'd just like to reinforce is the notion that climate change is here. We're starting to see the impacts at the local and regional scales. And it really is those scales that we need to start paying attention to. So a lot of local governments have been going alone on trying to figure out what their climate actions are going to be from an adaptation perspective as well as an emissions reduction perspective. But personally, in having been in this field for over 2 decades, what I have come to understand is that regional approaches are the next wave of really kind of promoting climate action that's effective and practical for the local scales. Regional approaches, what I mean by that is watershed-based approaches, given that, for instance, the watershed that I live in, there's about 15 municipalities that draw from the same services of that watershed and yet remain entirely uncoordinated among themselves as to what the projected climate risks are to the watershed, what the risks are to their local governments, and what the opportunities are to adapt and reduce emissions simultaneously. And I think operating at a more bio-regional scale actually takes us out of the jurisdictional lanes that we've been working in, that Enda was mentioning in terms of the siloization of our institutions, and really kind of reinforces the collaboration that's required moving forward to address risks in a collective manner and really coordinate across different jurisdictions to adapt to those risks. But it also provides an opportunity to collectively address emissions reduction and sustainability opportunities as well. So if we use climate risk at a watershed scale to really bring together different jurisdictions of governance to think about how to adapt, then we can also use that governance model to think about shared transportation options that reduce emissions regionally, as well as shared equity-seeking solutions regionally, and so forth. So we just build a different scale of governance, and I think it's at that scale that we really need to be addressing low-carbon resilient solutions.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. And I think I don't really have anything more to say after that. It captured exactly, what my feeling is what's needed. I guess what we're really talking about there is applying whole systems approaches to how we manage risks associated with climate change and how we, manage our communities, essentially. And so what that really means is thinking about things at multiple scales. So, for example, the work that we do is focused on scales as small as, individual plants in salt marshes on the coast and understanding how those plants can provide different levels of protection against waves in a coastal storm event. So that scale is important to our understanding of how, for example, nature-based solutions can be applied to support resilience and climate adaptation. But if we zoom out, to a much larger scale, the measures and the strategies that are deployed by communities on the coast are to a certain extent impact us as taxpayers across Canada because we're contributing to the collective community response to extreme hazard events. So I think we need to start thinking about community in a much broader sense, first of all on a Canada-wide scale, but even on a global scale, because I think, as Alison said at the beginning, in terms of climate action, mitigation and adaptation can't be considered in isolation. Those two things go hand in hand. And that's really, the essence of nature-based solutions, which endeavor to solve a problem, as solutions would imply, but also deliver a whole host of potential co-benefits that can contribute to a better society.
Thanks, Enda and Alison. So I'll just add by saying that if today we were to, let's say, convert all our systems to clean energy systems for transportations and buildings, we're still not going to be good because the CO2 levels in the atmosphere are still too high, and that's causing the climate impacts that we're seeing around the world. So going forward, climate innovation, the models that communities need to use would have to go beyond profit loss, would have to include surgical fixes, if you may, to address climate. And communities in Canada embody inclusivity, embody this innovative spirit and accountability to the citizens. So I feel that communities in Canada are well poised to start climate innovation, but it has to start from the realization that it cannot be put on the back burner anymore. And all citizens, everyone has to be involved in the effort. And truly, as the COVID pandemic showed us, if we wanted to address if we wanted to enhance the immunity of the citizen, then we have to put in a mix. So different vaccines from different companies were all part of the mix. It's the same thing with climate innovation and clean energy as well. It's going to have to be a mix with different approaches, and communities are a place where that innovation can spark.
And again, I'll echo what Alison said, that, far too often local communities try and go it alone. And so I guess the call to action that I would say, especially local communities, is to do more of this, like attend more conferences, get out there, try and break down the silos and the fragmentation that Enda was talking about, create partnerships with higher education, like Sammy was talking about. And even amongst ourselves, through the levels of government, try and get out there and for local governments to talk to the provincial and federal government to find out how to unlock these funding opportunities, and not only across the country, but internationally. Other countries, other local communities have solved a lot of these problems or are on their way to solving problems. And so just, again, more information sharing to break down some of those silos.
Wonderful. Well, those concluding remarks were a great way to wrap up. Thank you. Thank you to Allison, to Enda, to Sammy, to James for for sharing these initiatives, policy approaches, inspiring examples, and for your willingness to collaborate interdisciplinarily and across silos, and to give me a great excuse for why I didn't mow my lawn. So thank you. If you'd like to collaborate further on this type of initiative, we have a website here that you can see. It's Climate Innovation, or you can get in touch with our partnership hub or talk with particularly Sammy or Allison or I over the next couple of days. I wanted to give you an example of what we can aspire to and the beauty in our natural world to end with, since we had the images of the dead salmon at the beginning. This is the carrot. Thank you all for engaging in this discussion today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the Canadian Science Policy Conference.